So our next speaker is Lana Shah. So she has a MSc from the University of Saskatchewan. So she has worked for about 20 years in agronomy extension and research roles, first with the provincial government in Saskatchewan, and since 2010 with the Southeast Farm as research manager. Lana has conducted various research trials on many different crops and has found a niche in mixed grain intercropping research since 2012. She is contacted extensively by producers who want advice in implementing intercropping across the prairies. So please welcome Lana Shah.
Thank you. I'll just get everybody to get into their seats. It's nice to follow Scott and Yvonne because we're all kind of on a similar theme here. Though I'm still waiting for my invite to go to France, so we'll see if that happens sometime. So yeah, I'm being the import from Saskatchewan, although I'm barely across the border, so I'm kind of like an honorary Manitoban, and I'm kind of like an honorary North Dakotan too, because we're so close to North Dakota. So we're located at Redvers, Saskatchewan, which is in the extreme southeast of the province. And I work at a non-profit producer-directed research farm, a little bit like the diversification stations in Manitoba, only we're not provincial employees, so we're a little bit more off on our own. So I like when I'm talking to farmers and they say, "Where are you from?" And I say, "Well, I live at Redvers." But really what they mean is, where do you come from? And where I come from is the Rosetown, Kindersley area, not on the nice clay land either. And this is my grandfather who farmed his whole life in that area. My dad is still farming in that area. And my family has been farming that land for over 100 years. So the techniques that they have used to farm that land have changed dramatically from when they started until they finished. My grandfather, he was not growing lentils at the start of his career, but by the end of his farming career, they were growing lentils. They were doing no-till. Things that they thought they would never do, they ended up doing because the economics were there, it made sense, and so this is a way to introduce myself, but also a way to introduce the idea that we are capable of some really big changes that at first appear a bit outlandish, but once you really get into it, farmers are capable of really good changes when it's necessary. And I would say right now that we're at a time, I've been saying this for the last couple of years, so excuse me people that have already seen this, but still, we are at a point where there's some really tough problems in agriculture. We're in a lot of people are in a cash crunch, or you have crop out in the field, and really there's only so much we could do about that. We've had a hard year in 2019. But some of the reasons that there are some serious problems in agriculture right now is a lack of diversity. When I came to Redvers back in 2010, wheat canola was predominant. It's a 2-year rotation. There's a lot of other places where it's corn and soybeans, or it's lentils and durum. There's a very human tendency to want to simplify things, but biology is not simple. And by trying to oversimplify these crop sequences and try to find the easy button for cropping, we're actually somehow making it harder for ourselves. So I'm trying to find ways to embrace complexity and diversity, but this is not easy. And people want change, but want everything else to change around them. They don't want to have to actually do the changes. And the thing with intercropping, and I'm going to be talking mainly about mixed grain intercropping. So mostly where we're planting more than one grain crop at a time and harvesting them together. That's a complicated task. So I thought, since I'm probably talking to a lot of people that are new at intercropping, we would do kind of an introduction to what you need to think about and then get into talking about some of the intercrops. Can we do a little survey of who actually has done some intercropping grain crops before? Okay, we got a lot of repeats. So I hope you'll get quite a bit out of this. I'm not going data intensive on this because I figured I would have a lot of new people. And also some of the data that I'm really excited about is great in parts of the dark brown soil zone of Saskatchewan, but it's a little more of a stretch out here, so we're not going to get into my chickpea flax too much at all today. This is a steep learning curve. So, physically you might not be hiking up a hill, but learning-wise you are. So that if you want to go down this road, it is, you have to expect a lot to be learning a lot and being really challenged and being able to figure out how to fail in a controlled fashion. Because if you're afraid of failure, you're never going to try new things. So mixed grain intercropping, the way I use the term, is simultaneously growing more than one crop at a time, where you expect to have a mixed grain at the end coming out the combine. That's a very specific type of intercropping. So when people say intercropping, sometimes they just mean the grain intercropping, but a lot of the cover crops where you're overlapping cover crops and relay crops, and this is a technique that's been used for millennia and is used all over the world in various ways. But we're trying to figure out how to adapt it to our broad acre, mechanized, low labor agriculture system. Why do we want to do that? That's part of the things I'm supposed to be answering here. But maybe I refuse to answer that and say, why not? Which is, I was talking to Colin Rosengren, who's one of the sort of grandfathers, maybe you could call him, of the intercropping in Saskatchewan. OG intercroppers, and that's what he says. Why not? We're always looking for solutions to things and new ideas, and why would we not look at this as a way of dealing with our lack of diversity, the high risk, high input situation that farming is in a lot of the time right now? There are obstacles, and they are surmountable. But it has to be done in an intentional way, in an informed way. You can't just randomly throw crops together and expect magical things to happen, because in my experience, that's not how it works, or at least odds are a lot of them are not going to work. But there are multiple observed benefits that are documented in the scientific literature for productivity. So overall yield, a lot of the time there is over yielding, but you can't always bank on that year over year, because sometimes, especially in the dry years, you're not seeing the over yielding. The moisture is just not there to support more yield necessarily. And sometimes if you get it wrong, you can end up with less yield. That's what you're trying to avoid. But most of the time there is pest reduction in pests for various reasons. That's diseases and insects. And it probably most of the time more competition with weeds, but it depends on the crop combinations. Harvestability. If the grain intercrops are designed well, they're easier to harvest than a pulse crop would be on its own. One of the reasons people don't grow a lot of peas in Manitoba is because they lay on the ground. And if we can find ways of supporting those peas by growing them with more than one crop, that could be an advantage and a way to produce more peas in Manitoba. And given the processing capacity that's being put in place, I think that's an important goal. Nutrient efficiency. By growing pulses and a non-legume or non-nitrogen fixer together, there's efficiencies to be gained there. That doesn't necessarily mean that the legume is going to feed all of the nitrogen requirement to the whatever crop you're putting with it. That's not necessarily a realistic goal, but there are other efficiencies that can be gained. There's some risk mitigation to having more than one crop in the field. So there's across a landscape, there's areas where one crop will do better than another. By having both there, that's the situations often where farmers are seeing the over-yielding, because there's areas where the peas won't do well, or flax won't do well, or canola won't do well because of various things. Ecosystem services is a broad term. Some of the more practical things that we can see as farmers is impacts on erosion, impacts on snow trapping, and also having more biodiversity. It seems to be encouraging some of the beneficial pests and your soil biology, which we don't really understand very well. But more diversity tends to give them either a better habitat or a better diet, a more diverse diet. If you had a buffet all you can eat of only Kraft dinner for a year, you wouldn't be doing very well. But if you start adding more diversity to that buffet, then you're doing better. And our agricultural systems are kind of the same way. So where do you start? I think first off is you start with yourself. So why do you want to intercrop? What is your goals? And then what does success look like? Calibrate that, because if your expectations for, it has to do this well or it's no good, are unrealistic, then you probably don't want to start at all. So are they realistic goals? You're not going to get, most of the time you're not going to get 2 crops. If you plant 2 crops together, you're not going to get a full yield of one and a full yield of the other. So adjust your expectations. You're going to have less yield of both, but when you add them together, you may well get more value. So figure out if you're starting from the right place, and then adjust your expectations for the diversity and unpredictability that these intercrops are going to throw at you. So you might be intending to have, you grow canola and peas. I want lots of canola and not very much peas. But maybe you've got lots of peas and not very much canola, or the other way around. So year over year, you can have some really unexpected things happen. So Scott's example where they had pea and canola planted and the frost took out the canola. So now you've got pea and no ola. Maybe those peas are going to lodge. That wasn't really what you were planning for. It's not necessarily a bad outcome, but you've got to be able to think on your feet a bit and deal with the unexpected. And I think you need to give yourself the gift of some time and patience, because you are going to make mistakes, which is one of the reasons I try to get people to start relatively small with this. You're going to make some mistakes. You're going to be learning a lot. This is a steep learning curve. And some people will not want to stick with it, and that's okay. But give it some time. So at its base, we're looking for more resiliency and more profitability out of this intercrop. So that's what you need to look at. You may not have the bragging rights numbers of so-and-so got however many bushels and bragging about it at the coffee shop. You may not have that, but if you've got more profitability in the end, then that's really what does matter. And some of the places where we're getting more profitability is from the cost savings in controlling pests and in reducing fertilizer use. So earlier this month, I was in Montana at Great Falls, and I don't really know very much about their production system. Here, I'm only an hour and a half away, but down there in Montana, I don't really know. So I thought, well, let's play the intercrop game with them and start talking about what do you want to, what can you sell locally. And so here, mostly we're going to scratch off chickpeas. If anybody's really very adventurous, then we can talk chickpeas. But from now, we're going to kind of drop that off. But here, dry beans, soybeans, faba beans, peas, possibly even lentils are worth talking about. And the reason I've got the pulse in the middle is that you can kind of go either way. You can go with an oilseed companion or a cereal companion. The main argument where the cereal companions kind of are problematic is they're very competitive. So in order to get your pulses producing well, a lot of the time you have to drop the seeding rate of your cereals quite a bit. Not as true maybe for the peas, but almost everything else that would be the case. So something to keep in mind, that they're very competitive and also like a lot of nitrogen, and so you might end up with a nitrogen-stressed barley crop with not very much peas in it. That could happen. But it depends what your goals are. So a lot of the intercrops that I've worked on as research trials has been the pulses and oilseeds. One of the other reasons why I like the pulses and oilseeds is you'll notice most of those oilseeds are very small seeded, and most of the pulses are large seeded. That makes them easier to separate, and easy to separate means cheaper to separate. Whereas like a lentil and wheat, I don't really know how well you can separate that and how much you would pay to separate that. So that could be quite expensive. So canola pea is one that people are quite familiar with. and Scott's worked on that a lot. I have not worked on canola peas as much as Scott, but I have done some work on it. Flax and lentils is one I haven't even worked on yet, but some people are having some very good success with it at very low rates of flax. So you can't, there's some, once you've figured out, okay, here's a combination I want to try, then you have to figure out, what am I doing for seeding rates relatively? Most of the time, the pulse seeding rate stays pretty high because that's your nitrogen production factory. And the other one is more like a companion crop. It may still end up paying you out well. If the pulses are struggling, your companion crop may end up being even more dominant. But because of the nitrogen dynamics, usually we're trying to preferentially encourage those pulses. Flax and chickpea is one that I've worked with quite a lot since 2013. We're seeing major disease reductions in the chickpea with even relatively low amounts of flax. So that's really exciting. So one of the ones that is really interesting is camelina and lentils. So Three Farmers is, or you can do it with other companies, but Three Farmers is exclusively contracting camelina production that is intercropped. And that, I think, is the first time I've ever heard of that of a company exclusively contracting intercrops. And camelina is a very, very small seeded oilseed that is, flea beetles don't like it, but even though it's a brassica, and it's very frost tolerant, so it can be seeded earlier. So when combined with a lentil or a pea, it could be seeded earlier than canola with less risk of frost or flea beetles. And that was a problem this year that I was hearing over and over again with the pea canola, was that the frost and flea beetles took their ola. So camelina is a way around that, but it's a much smaller market. And then you can also add in the cover crops or a relay or something underneath that, as Scott was talking about with using alfalfa with the pea canola. So once you've adjusted your production system for diversity, it's easier to start adding even more diversity, partly because you've gotten away from some of the herbicides that are limiting you on that. So if you've already got a pea in there, chances are most of your forage legumes will partially tolerate whatever herbicides you're going to throw at them. One of the first things you need to figure out, if you're not organic producers, is what do you think you need to spray? And the intercrops tend to be more competitive than the oilseed or pulse will be on their own. So you may be able to get away with a bit less herbicides than you think, but baseline you may need some herbicides. So that will somewhat dictate which crop combinations you can use depending on what's registered. There are some herbicides that are registered for pulses and oilseeds that will control broadleaf weeds such as Authority or Silventrazone, and then your old Edge and Treflan and things like that, which do help some. And then if you put that on a cereal stubble, then you can still control your cereal volunteers. If you're an organic farmer, you don't really need to worry about that as much, which means you could be looking at more at triple crops. So this is actually surprisingly becoming more common, where people will grow an oilseed and a pulse and a cereal together, or two pulses and a oilseed together. So, but that also means more separation costs. So that's something to try to pencil in and estimate the costs of. So then we also want to know what can you sell and or use. So there's maybe some of these things that you can use on farm that you don't have a great market for. And what can you separate efficiently? Almost anything can be separated. It's how much it's going to cost to separate it. So that's something to keep in mind. We're going to get into that a little bit more throughout the presentation, especially as we get into the peas and oats. And then watch your herbicide residues. You now have two crops to worry about for herbicide residues instead of just one. And pay attention to what your volunteers are going to be, because you may have to worry about trying to separate those out also. So thinking about crop factors, you're looking at competitive ability of those crops. We don't think of flax as being very competitive, right? If you put it with a chickpea, especially under maybe some higher soil nitrogen conditions, flax can be quite competitive. So we're trying to use seeding rates and nitrogen availability as ways of influencing the competitive abilities of 2 crops or even 3. Variety and market class traits. This isn't something we know very much about, but between a little bit of trials and farmers just using their skills and knowledge to try to pick things that they think will work together, you try to put crops together that make sense. So, for example, maple peas work really nicely as an intercrop because they're a very lodgy kind of a pea. But that also means they can drag down whatever companion you're putting them with under some conditions. So it is more risk, but they're also worth more than your regular commodity pea. So there's some considerations there. Also, with, say, a canola, you're looking at clear field options versus some of the other types of herbicide packages in canola. There's not much shatter tolerance or really any early clear field varieties. So that's a kind of a sticky wicket depending on where you are. Matching maturity is really important. So especially if you're talking about pea canola, that can get unpleasant if your peas are ripe 3 weeks ahead of your canola. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it's even longer. And 2019 was a year where there was some of that going on. The canola was not ripening as fast as the peas were anywhere near. So lower risk idea is to use like a Polish canola with your peas instead, but then you're losing out on a herbicide option. So there's some balancing considerations. Harvest loss potential, and I'm talking about this from a potential downside. So if your peas or if your earlier crop is sitting there waiting for a period of time before your other crop is ready, or you have to go in and swath and you're taking a quality loss or something because of differences in maturity, that's something to really try to prevent problems with that and manage best you can. Either use desiccants, use swathing, or take something off at a bit higher moisture if necessary, and then deal with that afterwards. So the relative moisture of the crop. I wasn't planning on getting much into the storage of mixed grain crops. That's something that I'm hoping we'll have a trial done on soon for parameters for how to store the things safely. If both of them are at safe storage moisture on their own, then like a 14% pea isn't going to donate 2% to the canola. That's not how those things work. I'm assured by Joy Agnew, the engineer type person, that's not how that works. So people are storing the mixed safely as long as the grain is both considered dry in their own right. But we don't have good parameters on that. So skip that. So what about rotations? One of the things when people I think they've got a gotcha question for me, they say, what about rotations? You have not thought about this. And of course I have. We're actually involved in some Aphanomyces research trials and where I've actually had to do the Aphanomyces ratings in some intercrops and in monocrops. And so this is important. But Aphanomyces doesn't affect all of the pulses. So it affects mainly peas and lentils, plus a lot of those cover crops. Most of your clovers, and potentially the alfalfas, it does seem to be able to infect them, but we don't know how significant it is for peas and lentils. But be aware of that. So one of the strategies I've tried to encourage people to use is using, if you have a host, in a 4-year rotation, if you have one host, say a pea or a lentil, then 2 years later, when you want to do another pulse oilseed combination or something, use something that isn't a host. So use a soybean or a faba bean or a dry bean that is not a host of Aphanomyces so that you're not building that up. So putting a pea and a lentil in the same 4-year crop rotation wouldn't be a very good idea. But you can do it with some of these other pulses that don't share the same pests. So if I take that over to canola and flax basically don't share any of the same diseases, other than sclerotinia, which kind of bothers everything. So having a 4-year rotation that has both a canola and a flax in it shouldn't be a problem. We already do that with monocrops, so doing it with intercrops isn't a problem. So having more than one oilseed in a 4-year rotation shouldn't be a problem from a spacing crops out in time standpoint. So we can still have the benefits of what we've generally used for rotations by spacing crops out in time, while still having more diversity in space in each crop year. Now, point 3 is you don't have to intercrop everything in your rotation. I don't even think it's necessarily a good idea to intercrop everything in rotation. For one thing, that's way too much grain separation. You don't want to have to separate all the grain on your entire field. You might be trying to achieve 25%. So 1 in 4 years, you've got an intercrop, and the rest of the years, you've got monocrops. This isn't a thing where you're all in or all out like organic. It's either organic land or not organic land. With this, you can dabble. You can have an intercrop periodically in your rotation. And that way you can deal with some of your weed issues with using herbicides as necessary, because there are limited herbicide options. So apply the basic principles of crop rotations, but with more complexity. So we have to get more complicated. If you don't want to get more complicated, then you're in the wrong place. So seeding intercrops. First, you have to say, what do I have available for seeding, and how can this be adapted to seeding more than one crop at a time? Ideally, you're metering each crop separately. You can seed them as a mixture, mix the grain together and seed that as a mix, but it might settle out. You may not get the precision you want, but I have heard of people doing that quite successfully. It's not uncommon for forage and cover crops to seed mixtures. So intercrops, you could if you need to. That's probably more common for people that have a single shoot drill of some sort. Mixing the seed might be the necessary thing to do. But preferably you're metering 2 crops separately. Can you want the larger seed deeper? That's a good question. Do you have the capability of doing that with your machine? If it's using a mid-row bander, does your mid-row bander have packing of any sort? Or is it just digging it in there and hope, you may not have the establishment on those mid-row banders as what you would like. So we've got side banding, mid-row banding. That's normally used for fertilizer, that we can be thinking of trying to fit an extra seed in there. So then you have to be careful on where the crop still needs some kind of fertilizer, arguably. So you want to put that down in some fashion, but you may have to get a little more inventive, like using a liquid kit or doing a UAN in some fashion through the year. And seeding rates is a really important question, so it's better to be trying to think about those sort of things now rather than when you're already on the seeder and go, I don't know what seeding rate to use. So try to find as much information you can about whatever intercrop you want to seed. And I would say, if you're wanting to try this for the first time in your land, try several seeding rates and then keep track of what you used where. Because when you go out into the field, partway through the year when things are potting and getting down to business, you should be able to see differences in the balance of those crops and then try to decide which balance you think visually looks most productive. Yes, you may be able to get an idea of that when you take the combine through, but just visually, sometimes you can see, I have a plant with only a couple of pods here and I have a plant with lots of pods over here. That can make a difference in how you decide to do seeding rates. So it takes some local verification of those. So be careful of seed burn if you are putting fertilizer down with 2 seeds at a time. You can put them down in the same seed row at the same depth, but that works best under good moisture conditions. It can fall apart under some of those dry conditions we've seen the last couple of years. Variable rate nitrogen is an opportunity here, as is variable rate seeding. So this is not your grandfather's intercropping, because we can use the variable rate technologies to fine-tune things based on topography. For the fertilizers, you may want to try to preload or even follow up your crop to replace the nutrients that you exported. So plan well ahead of time for how you're going to get those nutrients to your crop when you're probably fully utilizing your seed or just putting seed down. And don't sabotage your nitrogen factory. What I mean by that is it's not a good idea. We're not seeing much point in putting a lot of nitrogen on your intercrops because that makes for lazy peas or lazy fava beans or lazy soybeans. And if you want an intercrop that's efficient, most of the time we're using less nitrogen fertilizer, not necessarily none, but considerably less. How do you harvest that? That's a good question I get asked a lot by people that are really sure that you have to go in and harvest it by hand, or you're going to take the combine through once and take one crop off and then blow all of the rest of it throughout the back. And farmers have figured out how to do this. So before you get in there with a combine, like I said, you need to be prepared for a few contingencies, be prepared to go out there and desiccate when it's time. And you may have to sacrifice quality on the later crop a little bit. If it's something like flax and there's relatively little flax, then and you've got one of their crops is more of your main crop, then you have to try to push the odds in favor of the crop that's worth the most. And then recourse to a swather, I think, is a good idea. So I'm in the don't sell the swather camp. And straight cutting can work really well as long as either you've desiccated or the maturities have lined up relatively well. So, like I said, try to optimize the value and the quality of the crop that you are capturing in your intercrop. And sometimes there's sacrifices to be made there, but ideally there isn't. Connect with more experienced farmers if you can. And they are out there, and they're generally still very happy to help other people because those farmers learned from someone else too. So there's events sometimes where there's more experienced intercroppers that you can talk to. Also Twitter. Twitter is amazing at helping farmers to connect with each other and help answer questions, because don't call me about how to set your combine for particular make and model, because I don't know. I'm going to have very general explanations for how to do some of this. That's what I rely on my farmer friends for on Twitter. I'll say, how do you suggest setting your combine for blah 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 intercrop, and then they help. The general principles, and this is kind of I don't know that much about the inner workings of combines, but the general idea is you set the combine for the larger seed and then turn down the wind a little, or the fans a little bit, so that you're not blowing the small seed out the back. That doesn't mean turn it off, but you make some adjustments to try to make sure you're blowing almost all the chaff and junk out while still retaining both seeds. And that takes a little bit of tinkering and practice, so be prepared to do that. The pulses, if you're doing flax, the pulses will thresh the flax bolls, but the bigger the pulse is, the more they are effective at that. So the chickpea flax works really nice. That's a big, rough seed that threshes up the flax bolls. Once you're getting down to lentils or soybeans or something like that, I think it would be you're going to have to get more aggressive, and you might have a bit more losses on your flax. Try small acres to get experience. You need to be able to fail in a controlled way so that you give yourself some time to learn and work the bugs out and figure out your separation system, and then it gets generally easier from there. Intercrop flax residue is not as annoying as monocrop flax residue. One of the reasons people really shy away from, a lot of people shy away from flax completely because they don't want to deal with it the next spring. They don't want to have to burn residue. Nobody burns intercrop flax residue. It breaks down really nicely. It goes through the combine really nicely. And in the spring, it's really not a problem to get through, unless there was a lot of flax and hardly any of the pulses. Then it might be a bit of a problem. This is an example from Montana. I'm pointing at that won't work. This was a field in Montana of chickpea flax, and where's the other guy? The other one is pea canola up here. There he is, Chris Jorgensen. So I think there's a reduction in soil erosion, better snow trapping from these intercrops because you've got a flax or a canola stubble sticking up there trying to catch snow. Pulse residue really doesn't do very much of that. And the carbon to nitrogen ratio of pulse residue is such that it doesn't build a lot of carbon in the soil. It breaks down relatively quickly. So I think there's actually advantages to having an intercrop there for better, more resilient residue for snow trapping, because maybe this year you guys don't really want to do some snow trapping, but there's certainly some places in the prairies where they do want to be doing some snow trapping. Grain separation. You need to separate it economically unless you're going to be feeding a mixed grain. And so a pea and oat, if you've got a market for that or a use for that, great, you don't have to separate it. If you do want to separate it, the easiest thing is large differences in seed size. If you're just counting on density to separate this, that's going to end up being a slower, more expensive process for the separation. The dockage cleaners will cost about 25 cents per bushel for cleaning. If you actually have to take it to a custom cleaning plant, you're going to be looking more like 50 cents to $1 a bushel. So if you have some high yield crops, that could get to be really quite expensive. And I've been, some of the seed cleaners have taken me to task for encouraging this intercropping because they don't want people showing up there with these intercrops and then complaining about their bill after and how terrible this is. You need to know this ahead of time. And if you end up with 100 bushel crop of peas and say peas and oats, then you've got to be able to budget for the separation of that, and that's going to take that's a large volume of crop, or even 150 bushels of peas and oats. That's going to end up being expensive to separate, so be prepared for that. Okay, so the pea and oat intercrop I did in 2019 at a few sites because General Mills and Sask Oat was quite interested in that. Because it was a dry year, I think we were getting land equivalencies, or basically very close to 1, which basically means we weren't getting the over-yielding that we typically like to see. The lodging, we didn't really have a lodging problem at the sites this year, and we're hoping to be able to repeat that. I'll quickly show you a kind of a scary chart. This is dollars per acre for our intercrops, or this is our intercrops at the top, and then the monocrops at the bottom. Short story there is, it was kind of a wash. There were some sites like mine where the intercrops ended up being worse. Take a picture of it and look at it in more detail later on. But over the gross value with this wasn't really, I'll go back, wasn't really that, it was similar to or a little less than one or the other of the monocrops. So not exactly what we're going for. A lot of them looked quite good, but some of our pea and oat monocrops were very good. So economics-wise, we're trying to crunch this out. It looked like $15 to $25 an acre, depending on your yield, of course, because your separation costs depend on your yield. And there was some cost savings in seed and fertilizer that we were able to achieve through this trial because we reduced the fertilizer application on the intercrops. But in the end, we were probably actually spending about $9 an acre more when you include the separation costs. So that's what happened in one particular year with a few sites of the pea and oat intercropping. We've already seen kind of an example of this from Scott, but this is David Ediger in Manitoba. Saskatchewan Crop Insurance has been collecting data on intercropping for a little while, just a couple of years, and this year it's 72,000 acres of intentional intercropping that was reported to them for people that are planning to separate the grain. So that doesn't include anyone where they planted a little bit of flax with their chickpeas and then don't plan to separate it, they're just going to sell it as stockage. So it's, if anything, an underestimate. That's where the intercropping is happening. Some of it not very far from Manitoba. And I don't know how much is happening in Manitoba. we're going to skip through a couple things here. This was a large green lentil and yellow mustard that I grew that stood up beautifully to all the way to harvest. Let's see if I can make that go. This should be a video. And my video doesn't want to work. There it goes. So this is my husband, technician, on our little old combine. And it was it was a really heavy crop of large green lentils that stood beautifully with the mustard. So, trying to skip ahead. There we go. So this is a picture of our chickpea flax with the monocrop chickpeas on this side and intercrop on this side. There was differences in maturity. Those monocrop chickpeas are still flowering when the other stuff is trying to mature. So that plays out on the field. So there is commercial uptake of these intercrops that are working out really well. I pulled out, there was some work that Scott and Chris Holtzapfel did a few years ago. This is a little bit of the pea and canola intercropping results that they got a few years ago. And the main point there was that canola likes nitrogen, we know that, but the intercrops were responding somewhat to nitrogen. This is the intercrops here, and you get a little bit more canola, but also a bit less peas as you increase the nitrogen. And that was in mixed rows. Alternating rows didn't work as well. We don't know why. But Chris did some marginal profits. So basically taking the cash costs off of the crop value. That doesn't take into account your land costs or anything. And the intercrops with these particular sites, this is what you hope to see, were as profitable as a fully fertilized canola crop in this situation. So that's interesting. They probably put a lot less at risk in order to achieve those same profits with this intercrop. So that's why it's attractive to people. So, challenge to farmers and the entire industry. This is a tricky new thing to try to undertake for everyone. But for farmers, I think there's good opportunities here and money to be made, and being on side with things that are good for soil and the environment. It's not very often where we have those both going in the same direction. For agronomists, there's opportunities here because this is such a steep learning curve for farmers. They need help with a lot of things here, whether it's VR mapping or helping with doing strip trials or helping to figure out what types of crops should they intercrop or varieties that they should try. It also means more boots on the ground. So, and literally, I mean, get your boots out on the ground, not just on your sprayer. And that is the end. Good time. Okay, so that's how to get a hold of me on Twitter and also my email and my phone number, so I don't mind talking to people. But I do encourage you, if you are interested in this, go get yourself on Twitter and get familiar with it. And then start looking up intercropping. Okay? Questions?
Thank you so much. Please take this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please, round of applause for...